There was a man named Kwame, feared in his village not for his strength, but for his greed. He had stolen land that did not belong to him, ancestral land that had passed through generations. The rightful owner, an old widow named Ya, pleaded with the village elders. But Kwame had wealth, influence, and knew how to twist the ears of power. No judgment came, no help arrived. 1 week later, something began to change. Kwame's cattle fell ill, one after the other. His youngest child became mute overnight. His dreams were filled with whispers, ancestral chants in a language he couldn't understand. He dismissed it all, until the third night when he woke up gasping, clawing at his throat, claiming an old man with white eyes had been sitting on his chest. This wasn't a horror movie, it was justice. Not by police, not by courts, but by the ancestors. In many African cultures, the courtroom was never made of concrete. It was made of spirit, tradition, and fear. Justice was not delayed, it was spiritual, immediate, and undeniable. And if you broke the moral order of the community, the ancestors didn't need a warrant to come for you. What Kwame experienced was not unusual. In African communities, justice was never only about evidence or laws. It was about truth, balance, and cosmic order. The ancestors were more than memories. They were enforcers of morality. They didn't forget. They didn't forgive easily. And when you crossed the line, their judgment came like thunder in the night. From the rainforests of Congo to the deserts of Mali, ancestral justice shaped societies. Every crime wasn't just against a person. It was against the community, the ancestors, and the spiritual equilibrium of the land. This is why traditional justice wasn't optional. It was embedded in the fabric of life. These systems operated without police sirens or written laws. Instead, there were sacred rituals, powerful oaths, and ancestral consultation. A person could be summoned by the elders, not just to answer for their actions, but to stand before the spirits. In many cases, people confessed out of fear, knowing the ancestors' wrath was more terrifying than any punishment man could give. Across the continent, from the forests of Ghana to the plains of Kenya, traditional systems of justice maintained peace long before colonial rule. Elders, spirit mediums, and ancestral rituals weren't just superstition. They were functional systems of accountability, often more effective and feared than any written law. These systems ensured that truth would surface, even if it came from the lips of the dead. These traditions taught that the unseen world was not far away. It was always watching. If you stole, lied, killed, or violated sacred order, the ancestors would know, and they would act. Sometimes slowly through illness or misfortune, sometimes swiftly with death or public shame. Either way, the message was clear. No one escapes ancestral judgment. In this video, we'll uncover how African ancestors delivered justice without stepping into a courtroom. We'll explore the sacred tools they used, the deadly consequences of lying under oath, and the eerie real-life cases where spiritual verdicts reshaped lives. You'll discover why, in many communities, the fear of ancestral wrath was more powerful than any police force. This isn't just about history. It's about a way of life that still lingers in shadows, in rituals, in whispered stories around the fire. A way of life where justice had no gavel, only the voice of the dead echoing through time. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. In many African societies, justice was never simply a process. It was a presence. It lived in the people, in the land, and most importantly, in the ancestors. These were not distant spirits, but active members of the community. They were guardians of morality and enforcers of cosmic balance. And their role in ensuring justice went beyond fear. It was built on deep respect, lineage, and sacred responsibility. In African cosmology, life is a circle: birth, death, and rebirth. Ancestors are not gone, they're transitioned, still watching, still involved, still powerful. They do not sleep. They exist between worlds, closer than the living imagine, and far more influential than the eye can see. If a person wronged another, they wronged the ancestors who watched over both parties. This is why reconciliation wasn't just social, it was spiritual. Oral tradition was the heartbeat of these systems. Stories were not just told for entertainment, they carried truth, law, memory, and consequence. Through proverbs, epics, and myths, each generation was reminded, justice is sacred. These oral accounts were living archives where the deeds of both the righteous and the wicked were remembered and passed on, not as gossip, but as warnings and wisdom. Among the Akan people of Ghana, for instance, the word Nananom Nsamanfo refers to revered ancestors who serve as divine witnesses. They were called upon during conflicts, invoked during rituals, and feared for their invisible hand in correcting wrongs. It was believed that when truth was hidden, they could reveal it through dreams, signs, illness, or even death. In this view, silence was never an escape. The truth always found its way out. This belief wasn't unique. Among the Yoruba, justice was tied to the concept of ase, the spiritual authority to speak and create reality. When someone invoked an ancestor's name in an oath, they weren't just swearing, they were activating ase, calling upon the very soul of justice to bear witness. If they lied, they didn't fear a judge, they feared the spiritual backlash of ase gone wrong. Some fell ill, some confessed, others simply disappeared. This is why African societies didn't depend on jails or judges to keep order. The real court existed in the conscience and in the invisible world. There was no need for cameras or guards. Your ancestors were the watchers, and your lineage could carry the consequences of your deeds for generations. Justice was not an individual matter. It was intergenerational. Spirituality and community were never separated. When a crime occurred, the elders and spiritual leaders consulted diviners and mediums, not to predict the truth, but to confirm what the community already sensed. A child stealing food might be forgiven, but a man who caused death or stole sacred land, that was a disruption to the soul of the village, and the ancestors would not allow that imbalance to linger. The justice process was also performative. It involved ritual, song, libation, and symbolism. A goat might be sacrificed to cleanse a curse. A pot broken at a shrine could symbolize the end of lies. The community would gather, not to punish, but to witness the restoration of truth. Justice here was not retribution. It was alignment, harmony, a return to moral balance. Even in times of war or migration, these systems traveled with the people. Justice was portable because it wasn't tied to buildings. It was tied to belief. Wherever Africans went, their ancestors followed, and the spiritual codes of right and wrong came with them. This is why, even today, in cities like Lagos or Nairobi, people still speak in whispers when invoking ancestors in matters of conflict. Ancestral justice was also rooted in accountability, not punishment. The goal was never to destroy the offender, but to restore the harmony of the group. A thief might return stolen goods publicly, with head bowed, and offer libations. A murderer might be required to perform years of labor for the victim's family. These weren't just penalties, they were spiritual negotiations with the realm of the dead. The African sense of justice also made room for complexity. It understood that wrongdoers were not always evil, sometimes they were desperate. Poi, cursed, misled. Elders didn't only judge, they listened, they prayed, they tried to understand the soul behind the sin, and the ancestors were believed to be the same. Firm but fair, feared but not cruel. This allowed justice to be human, yet sacred. One powerful element of this justice system was communal memory. Everyone in the village remembered. Everyone had a role in preserving truth. Gossip was discouraged, but knowledge of wrongs was stored collectively. This collective awareness meant that hiding the truth was nearly impossible. Your actions echoed through the village like drumming across a valley, heard even if denied. Even birth and death were touched by this system. A child born with mysterious illness might be seen as the reincarnation of someone seeking justice. A person dying in unexplained agony might be said to have been taken by the ancestors. Life itself was interpreted through a lens of cosmic justice. Every event was connected, every misfortune examined not just medically, but spiritually. Ancestral systems taught that justice and healing were inseparable. Conflict didn't end when a verdict was reached, it ended when the wound was closed. Rituals, sacrifices, confessions, and community forgiveness were all part of this closure. If a man wronged another, he didn't just make peace with the victim, he had to restore favor with the ancestors, the spirits, and the land. In African ancestral systems, justice was not transactional, it was transformational. A wrong act could rupture generations. A single lie could awaken a lineage of sleeping spirits, but forgiveness and balance were always possible. If the offender acknowledged the ancestors, performed the right rites, and truly repented. The focus was always on resolution, not revenge. In this world, the ancestors were never silent. They spoke through dreams, through the mouths of the possessed, through sudden illness, and through inexplicable turns of fate. And their justice did not need lawyers. It only needed truth. That truth, once uncovered, could heal or destroy. It was up to the offender to choose. In the realm of ancestral justice, words alone did not determine guilt or innocence. The unseen had to be consulted, and for that, African societies developed powerful spiritual instruments, tools of invocation, protection, revelation, and punishment. These tools were not symbolic, they were real, and to use them without caution was to flirt with spiritual peril. One of the most feared tools was the ancestral oath. When someone was accused and denied wrongdoing, they could be asked or dare to swear by the ancestors. This wasn't an empty ritual. It meant standing before a shrine, invoking the names of the dead and declaring innocence. If you lied, the punishment wasn't from people, it was from beyond. Death, illness, madness, these were known outcomes of falsely swearing. The power of the oath came from Ase, the life force, the divine authority that made words binding. Once you invoked Ase, your body and soul were accountable to the spiritual world. Even those who had committed crimes would hesitate to lie under oath. Some would flee, refuse the ritual, or break down and confess before it began. Fear of ancestral consequence was that deep. Another instrument of justice was the ordeal. In cases where guilt could not be proven, the spirits were asked to decide. A person might be made to drink a concoction blessed by a diviner. If they vomited or fell ill, they were considered guilty. In some communities, they'd plunge their hand into boiling oil or walk over fire. Survival meant innocence. Pain or injury was interpreted as a verdict from the ancestors themselves. These ordeals were never carried out recklessly. They were sacred, overseen by elders, spiritual leaders, and witnessed by the community. The belief was clear: humans may lie, but the spirits do not. And so, people accepted these outcomes with trembling respect. Even the accused, if found guilty through ordeal, would often not resist. The judgment was final, because it came from the other side. The use of spirit mediums was also central. These were people believed to be chosen by the ancestors to serve as vessels. During disputes, a medium could enter trance, channel the voice of a deceased elder, and speak with divine authority. When this happened, even the proudest chiefs would fall silent. A possessed voice, trembling and old, speaking hidden truths no one else knew, was not to be questioned. Libation was another powerful act. Pouring water, palm wine, or gin on the ground while invoking the ancestors was more than a gesture. It was a call, a plea for their presence. During justice rituals, libations opened the spiritual court. They were used to bless truth, to invite witness, and to cleanse lies. Without libation, no ritual had power. Among the Igbo, the Ala shrine, dedicated to the earth goddess, was often the site of justice rituals. Crimes against the land, like incest or murder, were believed to offend not only the community, but the land itself. The offender would have to kneel before the shrine, confess, and offer atonement. If they refused, it was said that the earth itself would swallow them, or their lineage would suffer. Masks and costumes also played a role. In masquerade traditions, spirits were believed to inhabit the masked dancers. When these spirits danced in the village, they didn't just entertain, they judged. They spoke in riddles, revealed secrets, punished those who were hiding sins. To mock them was to mock the ancestors. To hide from them was to invite judgment. Every object used, beads, feathers, stones, drums, had symbolic and spiritual power. The color of cloth, the type of incense burned, the hour of day, nothing was random. Rituals followed strict codes handed down from generations, often guarded by priesthoods or family lines. Breaking ritual law during justice proceedings was a sin on its own and could result in spiritual backlash. The effectiveness of these tools was not questioned because their consequences were visible. Stories abounded of those who falsely swore oaths and later lost their minds, or those who mocked the spirits and died mysteriously. These were not coincidences, they were proof. And this proof reinforced the authority of ancestral justice, even in the face of colonial rule. Even today, in urban centers with high courts and police stations, some still resort to these tools. When the legal system fails, or when truth is hidden too well, families will travel back to ancestral homes, seek the elders, and request spiritual justice. In many regions, the ancestral oath is still feared more than a jail cell. What makes these tools powerful is not just their mystery, but the collective belief that surrounds them. An oath works because the entire community believes it does. A curse has weight because generations have seen it manifest. This belief becomes law, and in that shared faith, justice is carried out. These ancestral tools weren't about inflicting pain. They were about uncovering truth when truth refused to show its face. They were the voice of a world beyond the living, precise, terrifying, and just. In the next section, we'll step into the village courtroom itself, where these tools met the elders, the community, and the accused, and justice was spoken. Not from books, but from the soul. In traditional African society, justice was not a distant concept handed down from impersonal institutions. It was lived, it was visible, and the center of that justice was the village courtyard, a sacred space where the living and the spirit world met to decide the fate of the accused. The courtroom was not made of walls. It was under the open sky, in the shade of an old tree, or at the foot of an ancestral shrine. Elders sat in a semicircle, staff in hand, their eyes sharpened not just by age, but by generations of memory. These were not men and women chasing power. They were guardians of balance, chosen for their wisdom, their spiritual discipline, and their knowledge of history. When someone was accused, they were summoned, not by force, but by reputation. Refusing a village court was not just disrespectful, it was suspicious. It signaled guilt. The entire community might gather, young and old, to listen. Justice here was not private, it was public, because wrongdoing affected everyone. A lie could fester like rot in yam. It had to be exposed before it poisoned the whole harvest. The elders listened, but more importantly, they watched. They observed body language, tone, hesitation, contradiction. They understood when a person was scared, lying, or under spiritual influence. Some elders were trained in interpreting signs like sudden wind, bird calls, or a child crying during testimony. These signs were not ignored. They were read like sacred texts. Testimonies were not just between accuser and accused. The village memory played its role. Witnesses came forward. Elders recalled events, family histories, previous behavior. An old woman might remember that the accused once disrespected a sacred tree. A man might share how a similar theft occurred years ago and how the ancestors punished it. Justice in this space had roots, deep roots. But the courtroom was not about winning, it was about truth. There were no lawyers, no technicalities, just voices, silence, and the unseen. If a lie was suspected, the accused might be asked to swear an ancestral oath, or a medium might be consulted. The ritual tools from Section 2 were now put to use, not as threats but as final tests. Confession was not weakness. In fact, it was expected. The system allowed for redemption. If the accused confessed early and showed remorse, the punishment was lighter. The goal was never to destroy, but to restore. A person might be asked to pay back what they stole, offer a goat, or kneel before the community and the ancestors. The justice was not transactional, it was spiritual healing. The elders also mediated dialogue. They gave the accused space to speak, to explain, to ask for mercy. The accuser, too, was questioned, harshly if needed. False accusations were deadly serious. If proven false, the accuser could be made to take the same oath, or even face punishment from the spirits for invoking them unjustly. Justice, in this form, protected everyone. When a verdict was reached, it wasn't shouted. It was spoken with calm, finality, and spiritual weight. You must return what was taken. You must perform cleansing rites at the river. You are to be watched by the community for 1 season. These were not mere words. They were binding instructions. To disobey was to risk spiritual backlash, not just for the individual, but sometimes for their children, even unborn. Sometimes reconciliation ceremonies followed. The accused and accuser might share a meal, pour libation together, or embrace before the community. A drum might be played, songs might be sung. The goal was not just punishment, it was reintegration. The offender, if purified, was welcomed back. The wound was closed, harmony restored. There were times, however, when the crime was too severe. Murder, incest, violations of sacred taboos. In these cases, exile might be declared. The offender was told to leave the land, physically and spiritually. In some cases, they were branded spiritually and could not be buried with their ancestors unless reparations were made. Death outside the spiritual family was one of the greatest punishments. Despite the simplicity of this village courtroom, its effectiveness endured. Because it was more than a system, it was a belief, a social contract reinforced by culture, history, and the unbroken gaze of the ancestors. And even today, in the shadows of skyscrapers and modern laws, this courtroom still lives. In rural villages, in family compounds, in whispered meetings between elders. The spirits still sit in judgment. In the heart of Benin, there's an old story told around fires. A wealthy trader named Osahan cheated his partner out of their shared earnings. He denied the theft and even mocked the ancestors publicly, claiming, "Let them come if they dare." 3 days later, he collapsed in the marketplace. Eyes open, mouth shut, body stiff as wood. No illness, no warning, just silence. His family called the oracle, and the verdict was chilling. The ancestors had taken him. Such stories are not rare. In many African communities, the justice of the ancestors is not folklore, it's feared reality. When someone commits a moral or spiritual crime and escapes human punishment, the ancestors are believed to intervene, and when they do, the consequences are as strange as they are terrifying. In northern Ghana, among the Dagombas, there's a ritual known as Bohimbu, where a person accused of theft can call for a spiritual test. In one case, a man who swore he did not steal a neighbor's goat agreed to be tested. A fetish priest placed a calabash in front of him and called upon the spirits to act. That night, the man's belly began to swell uncontrollably. He confessed at dawn. The goat was returned. His stomach returned to normal within hours. Ancestral punishment rarely struck in broad daylight. It came like a shadow, through illness that resisted healing, dreams filled with warnings, children born with unexplained deformities, or businesses that suddenly failed. What modern medicine might call psychosomatic, these communities called evidence. And once the signs appeared, no one questioned where they came from. Sometimes the punishment didn't come to the offender directly. It came to their children. Among the Igbo, it is said that if a man violates a sacred law and refuses to confess, his children may fall sick repeatedly until he atones. There are cases where a dying child's last words were interpreted as messages from the ancestors, forcing the parent to reveal long-hidden sins. In East Africa, the Kikuyu believe in kirumi, a curse of justice passed from ancestors. There's a well-known case of a man who stole ancestral land from his cousin. Not only did he deny it, he built a mansion on it. The house never stood. Each year, part of it collapsed, roof, walls, gate, until nothing was left but broken bricks. The land was returned. Only then did peace return to the family. What's eerie is not just the punishment, but how it finds the guilty with surgical precision. In some cases, people who were not even suspects became haunted. They'd confessed to crimes no one knew had happened. In one story from the Ashanti region, a woman confessed on her deathbed to poisoning her co-wife 20 years earlier. The trigger, a vision of her dead grandmother standing at her bedside every night for a week. Punishments could also be communal. If a taboo was broken, such as defiling a sacred river, the entire village could suffer. Crops might fail. Rain would stop falling. In such cases, diviners were consulted and sacrifices made. But the ancestors' demand was clear. The wrong must be named, and the wrongdoer must confess. Perhaps the most terrifying form of ancestral justice is spiritual death. Not physical death, but social and spiritual isolation. The person is alive but no longer seen. Their name disappears in conversations. No greetings, no invitations. It's as though the ancestors have stripped them of identity. This kind of punishment is feared even more than exile or illness. Sometimes offenders tried to escape justice by fleeing, but many stories warn, the spirits travel. A thief who left Nigeria and settled in the UK reportedly began seeing shadows in his room. He returned home, confessed, and offered restitution. Peace followed. For traditionalists, this was no coincidence. It was justice served across oceans. The most dramatic stories are the ones where wrongdoers, under ancestral pressure, publicly confess with tears, shaking hands, and trembling voices. These confessions are often unexpected, at weddings, funerals, or naming ceremonies, moments when the spiritual realm is near. The confession lifts the weight, but until it comes, the soul cannot rest. And when justice is done, the atmosphere changes. The village breathes again. Children laugh freely. Rain falls again. The accused, though ashamed, often says afterward, "I feel lighter." Because ancestral justice, while terrifying, is not about vengeance. It's about setting things right, about rebalancing the cosmic scales. These stories endure not because they are shocking, but because they are believed. Not as myths, but as warnings. They are told by grandmothers, remembered by chiefs, and whispered by those who've seen too much to doubt. And though skeptics may scoff, even the most modern Africans know there are things beyond explanation, and justice is not always human. Ancestral punishment was feared because it was just. It didn't rely on evidence, it was the evidence. It didn't need a courtroom, it was the courtroom. And no matter how clever, how powerful, or how far one ran, the spirits always found a way. Because in African justice, the dead are never truly dead. They are the judges behind the veil. The belief that ancestors deliver justice may seem distant in a world of lawyers, courtrooms, and surveillance cameras. Yet, across Africa, echoes of the old ways still remain. In villages and cities alike, people still whisper before shrines, still pour libation before decisions, still invoke names that have not been spoken in generations. Why? Because deep down they know, justice isn't always written in laws. Sometimes it's carved into spirit. Modern legal systems, modeled after colonial frameworks, often leave communities disillusioned. Cases drag for years, victims feel unheard, corruption seeps in. And so people return, not to nostalgia, but to what worked. What held people accountable, not through fear of prison, but fear of spiritual exposure. In this return, we witness a quiet resurgence of ancestral justice. In Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and beyond, traditional councils are being revived. Elders are being called back to mediate. Spirit mediums are once again asked to confirm truths that no CCTV can capture. These aren't backward steps, they are reconnections. Reminders that justice is not only about systems, it's about trust, about truth, about healing. Of course, ancestral justice has its limits. It can be abused, misinterpreted, or weaponized. Just like any system, it requires integrity. It demands guardians who are spiritually grounded, not hungry for power. It thrives not in fear, but in balance. When practiced with wisdom, it becomes more than judgment. It becomes medicine for the soul. Perhaps the greatest strength of ancestral justice is its intimacy. It doesn't treat wrongdoers as statistics. It sees them as part of the whole. A thief is not an enemy, they are a broken thread in the communal fabric. The goal is not to cut them out, but to weave them back in. That kind of justice transforms communities. In a time where courts are overloaded and human rights are debated in boardrooms far from the people they affect, ancestral justice reminds us there are other ways. Ways that listen, ways that see, ways that hold us accountable not just to law, but to legacy. Maybe that's why the fear of ancestral punishment still lingers. It's not about spirits hiding under beds, it's about knowing that someone somewhere sees everything, that even when no human is watching, truth will rise. And justice, even if delayed, will arrive, carried not by gavels, but by the footsteps of the ancestors. So next time you hear the wind rustle through the trees at night, or a sudden silence fall over a crowd, remember, in many parts of Africa, justice does not always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears the silence of the grave, and the voice of a grandmother's warning. The ancestors are not gone. They are present, they are patient, and when the world fails to deliver justice, they still rise, with calm eyes, steady hands, and a truth that cannot be buried. If you found this story powerful, enlightening, or thought-provoking, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from the soul of Africa.